The Duke's scandal. He wanted to turn the maid into his mistress, but the son fell in love. The grand hall of Fitzwilliam Manor, with its towering ceilings and imposing ancestral portraits, seemed to always be watching Richard. He knew what everyone expected of him, to become a reflection of his father, with the same fierce ambition and unyielding strength that made the Duke both feared and respected. But for Richard, this role was uncomfortable, almost suffocating. He preferred the calm of the gardens to the commotion of family gatherings, and books fascinated him far more than the strategies of power his father tried to impose on him. Each time the Duke looked at him with that restrained expression of disappointment, Richard felt the weight of a title that seemed ill-suited for him. Francis, the younger brother, was everything Richard could never be, and he knew it all too well. With his sharp charisma and a cunning nature that bordered on manipulation, Francis excelled in the art of pleasing the Duke. Where Richard saw dilemmas and hesitations, Francis saw opportunities to shine, to draw closer to their father, and perhaps even to claim the family throne in silence. For Francis, Fitzwilliam Manor was a chessboard, and everyone, including his own brother, were pieces he skillfully maneuvered to his advantage. Every smile, every word was meticulously planned to strengthen his position, even if it meant undermining his father's confidence in Richard. And the Duke, ever hungry for an ambitious heir, seemed blind to Francis's wavering loyalty. Over time, Richard began to feel like a stranger in his own home, not just because he lacked the same fervor for power, but because he realized more and more that his presence seemed more a disappointment than a source of pride. He tried, with quiet effort, to please his father, but the harder he tried, the further he seemed from the idealized image the Duke had in mind. Meanwhile, Francis appeared to grow in influence and confidence, claiming a space that should have been Richard's. And amid this silent struggle, Richard couldn't help but wonder, could it be that the honor and title of heir truly belonged to the younger brother who so desperately craved power? Georgiana arrived at the Fitzwilliam estate as a shadow of who she once was. Her clothes were worn, her steps hesitant, and her ever-watchful eyes betrayed the constant fear that someone would recognize her and send her back to the nightmare she had fled. Running away had been her only choice, a brave decision, but one fraught with risks, especially for a woman without money or a family to take her in. After days of wandering, hungry and exhausted, the sight of Fitzwilliam Manor appeared as an unexpected refuge. Securing a position as a maid was a profound relief. There, even under the weight of exhausting tasks, Georgiana found something she had sought for so long: safety. At first, she worked hard to be invisible. She moved through the corridors with light steps, kept her gaze lowered, and never dared to raise her voice. After all, a maid who draws attention is a maid who finds trouble, and Georgiana had endured enough trouble for a lifetime. However, her naturally elegant demeanor and refined way of speaking, though discreet, did not go unnoticed for long. There was something about Georgiana, a quiet dignity perhaps, that set her apart from the other servants. Even as she toiled, scrubbing floors or carrying heavy trays, she exuded a grace that caught eyes and sparked whispers among the staff. Slowly, the mysterious maid began to arouse curiosity. Rumors about the new maid soon reached more attentive ears, and Georgiana quickly realized she was being watched with growing interest. Some servants murmured about her understated beauty and aura of mystery, but she had no idea that these whispers were beginning to cross the boundaries of the service quarters. She didn't know that among those watching her was someone whose eyes gleamed with a restrained fascination, and who might understand the vulnerability hidden beneath her composed exterior. But the secrets Georgiana carried were heavy, and her life, already marked by pain, was about to be touched by a destiny far more complex than anyone could have foreseen. For the Duke of Staffordshire, the world was a stage where he played the lead role, and everyone else was merely a supporting cast, ready to fulfill his desires. His orders were obeyed without hesitation, his whims catered to with precision, and he had never known the discomfort of hearing no. When his eyes fell on Georgiana, something within him stirred, like an unexpected spark. She was a maid, yes, but there was an intriguing mystery about her, a delicate strength that captivated the Duke in ways he couldn't explain. She was discreet, diligent in her work, but her movements held a grace that did not align with her station. Enchanted, the the Duke decided he wanted her, and for him, wanting had always been the first step toward having. For Georgiana, the Duke's attention was a terrifying reminder of her darkest days. She had escaped a stifling marriage where she was controlled, humiliated, and stripped of her dignity, and now it seemed fate was playing a cruel trick on her. Instead of finding the peace she had so desperately sought, she found herself under the relentless gaze of a powerful man accustomed to obtaining everything he desired. To the Duke, her every act of resistance was an invitation, a challenge to be conquered. But for Georgiana, each encounter with him was a test of her courage. She knew that rejecting his advances could have dangerous consequences, yet yielding would mean surrendering the last spark of freedom she had left. She wanted to keep her distance, but how long could she resist? Each time the Duke summoned her, Georgiana felt the ground crumble beneath her feet. She used every ounce of her skill to evade prolonged conversations and private encounters, knowing full well that her resistance only deepened the Duke's fascination. He was a man who did not understand limits, and his determination seemed to grow with every subtle refusal she offered. The tension between them became palpable, like a cruel game in which only one side could triumph. Georgiana felt trapped, her haven transformed into a new prison, and her heart was a whirlwind of fear and defiance. Each day, the decision of what to do grew harder, and deep down, she knew that danger was closing in, slow and inevitable, like a storm on the horizon. To Richard, there was something both captivating and inexplicable about Georgiana. He observed her in silence, never daring to approach, but his eyes were always drawn to her. She possessed an innate grace, something so rare amid the frenzy of domestic chores, that he could scarcely believe she was merely a maid. She carried trays and scrubbed the manor's darkest corners with a dignity that defied her humble position. Richard could sense that her every movement concealed a hidden strength, an invisible burden, and a deep sorrow that no one else seemed to notice. No matter how much he tried to resist, he found himself imagining ways to ease the pain she never acknowledged, neither through words nor actions, but which he could see, clear as day, in her eyes. Georgiana, too, felt something unusual every time her path crossed with Richard's. Unlike the Duke, whose gaze pursued her as if she were a possession to be claimed, Richard's eyes held a gentleness, almost a hesitancy, as if he feared startling her. There was a subtle warmth in his demeanor, a mutual understanding that required no words. Each time their eyes met, she felt an unexpected peace, a sense that someone, at last, saw her for who she truly was. Not merely a maid, but a person with broken dreams and hidden scars. Georgiana knew this silent affection was dangerous. Between them lay an abyss of social conventions and family expectations that could not be ignored. Yet neither could look away. The tension between them grew in silence, like a flame feeding on its own air. With every encounter, their hearts quickened, even if they exchanged no words. Those stolen moments of unspoken connection made Georgiana's solitude more bearable and Richard's melancholy sweeter. Both knew they were treading dangerous ground. In a household where the Duke ruled with an iron fist, even a glance could be interpreted as betrayal. Still, they continued to defy fate, gazing at each other with an intensity that, deep down, was a silent promise, a promise they might never be able to fulfill. When the Duke finally announced his intention to make Georgiana his mistress, Richard felt his world collapse. The thought of his father laying claim to someone so vulnerable, someone Richard admired deeply, felt cruel and repulsive. To the Duke, a maid was nothing more than entertainment, a meaningless diversion. But to Richard, Georgiana was so much more, a wounded soul he longed to protect. Desperate, Richard took an unthinkable step. He sought out his brother, Francis. Francis accepted the deal with barely concealed enthusiasm. To him, this offer was not just a gift, but a golden opportunity. With a calculating glint in his eye, Francis realized he could kill two birds with one stone, secure the family throne, and simultaneously ruin his brother. Richard's proposal was a gift he would never refuse, but altruism was the furthest thing from his mind. He planned to ensure that Georgiana's escape caused as much scandal as possible. In Francis's mind, this was the perfect chance to ridicule Richard and win their father's unwavering trust. And Richard, blinded by his desire to protect Georgiana, failed to see that his own brother was weaving a trap. With a desperation that bordered on recklessness, Richard threw himself into the plan. He orchestrated every detail of the escape, convinced that, with Francis's help, he could finally grant Georgiana the freedom she deserved. But the truth was, he was handling a treacherous flame, and the consequences of this risky agreement were beyond his comprehension. In his heart, there was uncertainty, a fear he tried to ignore, but that haunted him in the silent hours of the night. Would the price of his love for Georgiana cost him his honor, his position, and perhaps even his father's respect? The escape plan was nearly in motion, each passing second bringing Georgiana closer to the promise of freedom. She knew the risks were high, but the thought of finally escaping the Duke's clutches was an unexpected relief after years of torment. Richard, though nervous, was convinced his sacrifice had been worth it. Giving up his inheritance to Francis was a steep price, but he believed his renunciation was Georgiana's salvation. However, he had underestimated his brother's ambition and coldness. The confrontation that followed was a storm of fury. The Duke, who had always regarded Richard as weak, was outraged by what he saw as a public humiliation. His eyes, usually cold, now burned with uncontrollable anger as he accused his son of tarnishing the Fitzwilliam name. To him, there were no excuses, no redemption. Richard had stooped to the level of a maid and, in doing so, dragged the family legacy through the mud. In an instant, the heir lost everything: his father's trust, the family's respect, and even the right to remain in his own home. The Duke, relentless, decreed Richard's exile, cutting him out of his life without hesitation, while Georgiana was confined to the estate, under watch, like a prisoner without a crime. As he left the mansion, Richard felt shattered, carrying with him the sharp pain of betrayal. He had given everything for love, but instead of freeing Georgiana, he had condemned her to a new prison. The image of his brother, triumphant and unfeeling, and his father's devastated gaze haunted his mind like an unbearable weight. And the thought of Georgiana, alone, imprisoned, and unprotected, only deepened his anguish. Francis's betrayal was a cruel blow, a reminder that his brother's ambition had always outweighed any familial bond. As he departed, Richard's heart was broken, knowing he had failed in his most sacred promise, to protect the woman he loved. When Georgiana learned that Richard had been exiled because of her, it felt as though the ground had disappeared beneath her feet. The thought that he was paying the price for trying to protect her was unbearable. Richard, who had only wanted to give her a chance at freedom, had been punished cruelly and unjustly. Consumed by desperate determination, Georgiana resolved to sacrifice everything she had left. In an act of courage and resignation, she went to the Duke and, with a steady gaze, proposed the unthinkable. She would become his mistress if he would allow Richard to leave in peace. The proposal wounded her deeply, but to Georgiana, this was the price of true love, a love that, to endure, demanded her very soul. The Duke accepted her offer with a triumphant smile. To him, Georgiana's submission was a double victory. He not only secured a woman he desired, but also punished Richard for the weakness of becoming involved with someone so beneath the Fitzwilliam family. Without hesitation, he finalized Richard's exile, viewing it as one less burden on the family legacy. But for Georgiana, every day spent by the Duke's side was slow and painful torture. Her freedom had been exchanged for an emotional prison that suffocated her more than any physical cell ever could. The weight of her decision crushed her, but she repeated to herself that she had done what was necessary, that at least Richard was free and far from that oppressive environment. Separated by a distance that felt insurmountable, Richard and Georgiana each bore an almost unbearable pain. He, unaware of the sacrifice she had made, felt defeated and powerless, while she endured the cold, calculated presence of the Duke, sustained only by the memory of the love she had shared with Richard. Despite all the pain and separation, that love endured in their hearts, like a flame stubbornly refusing to be extinguished. Each moment beside the Duke was a new scar for Georgiana, but her love for Richard still pulsed, resilient and silent, waiting for a future that, even in its darkness, she still dared to dream of. Time proved to be a relentless enemy for the House of Fitzwilliam. With Richard exiled and the Duke aging rapidly, Francis, finally in control, ruled with the ferocity he had always craved. He governed the estate with an iron fist and, in his fervor to display strength, treated allies as mere pawns. His hasty decisions and questionable alliances soon sowed distrust among neighboring nobles, who now regarded him with a mix of contempt and caution. The mansion, once a symbol of stability and tradition, began to wither under the weight of silent conspiracies and betrayals. Blinded by his own ambition, Francis failed to see that his relentless pursuit of power was ironically eroding the very legacy he so desperately sought to protect. The Duke, meanwhile, had become a bitter shadow of his former self. Without the son he deemed more suitable, and witnessing Francis's increasingly disastrous choices, he sank into corrosive resentment. Obsessed with keeping Georgiana under his control, the Duke became an even more tyrannical figure, alienating even his most loyal servants and turning the mansion into a prison of constant tension. His fits of rage became frequent, a stark reminder of the inevitable decline looming over the family. Rumors of his failing health and the chaos within the Fitzwilliam household spread like wildfire, transforming the once respected mansion into a source of discomfort and even fear. Then, the Duke's unexpected death sent shockwaves through all who knew him. The man who had long been a pillar of authority and pride was gone under suspicious circumstances, leaving behind a fractured family and an empire teetering on the edge of ruin. Without the Duke's fierce presence, the mansion descended further into chaos. Francis's tenuous alliances were insufficient to maintain the family's influence, and he found himself surrounded by once hidden enemies, ready to strike. The Fitzwilliam name, once synonymous with power and tradition, now became little more than a faded memory of past glories. With the Duke's death, the oppressive rigidity of the Fitzwilliam mansion seemed to dissolve, finally freeing Georgiana from years of confinement. For the first time in years, she moved without the weight of orders or cold stares tracking her every step. Each stride through the vast hall echoed with a lightness she hardly recognized, and as she crossed the gates of the estate, her heart pounded with the promise of freedom. She didn't look back. The past, with all its horrors and sacrifices, would remain behind, trapped within those oppressive walls. Breathing in the fresh air of the open road, Georgiana allowed herself to dream again, daring to wish for something she thought impossible: to find Richard and see if the love they shared had withstood the test of time and distance. The path to the village was arduous, but for Georgiana, each step felt like a rebirth. The dust of the road and the heat of the sun seemed insignificant compared to the years of oppression and fear. She barely felt the fatigue, her heart instead racing with an anxious joy, an expectation she could not suppress. As she drew closer, doubts crept into her mind. Would Richard still recognize her? Or had time and suffering turned them both into strangers? Fear and hope battled within her chest, but neither could stop her from moving forward. Guided by the memory of those fleeting moments of tenderness that had once illuminated her darkest days, Georgiana pressed on. As the small village came into view on the horizon, Georgiana's heart raced, as if all the exhaustion of her journey suddenly hit her at once. It was a mix of fear and euphoria, longing and hesitation. That humble village represented a new life, a chance at a love she had nearly deemed impossible. Every small house, every distant tree seemed to whisper promises of a future she had never dared to dream. With that, she found the courage to take the final steps, each one bringing her closer to the man who, even from afar, had been her constant light. At last, she was where she belonged, free, determined, and ready to discover whether the love that had united them had survived the passage of years. When Georgiana saw Richard standing at the doorway of the small house in the village, her heart raced with a mix of disbelief and euphoria. He looked different, his features etched with the passage of time, his posture humbler, and his expression slightly weary. But his eyes still held the same tenderness that had once made her feel safe. That gaze, full of understanding and kindness, made everything around her fade away. Without hesitation, she ran into his arms, and they embraced as if no time had passed. It was a reunion without words, but each touch carried an undeniable truth. The love they had nurtured in secret and against all odds remained intact, like a flame that had never been extinguished. The days that followed were filled with a quiet happiness, as if both feared breaking the enchantment of the simplicity they had found together. There were no grand halls or watchful eyes now, just a small house surrounded by fields and open skies, where the greatest luxury was the right to be themselves. Each morning, Richard and Georgiana met in their simple daily tasks. He tending the garden, she preparing tea, and every gesture was a reminder that they could now laugh and talk without fear, building a life where they no longer had to hide. It was a modest existence, but the peace they found in each other's company was a wealth no nobility could ever offer. As days turned into weeks, Richard and Georgiana discovered a happiness that, while understated, was profound and enduring. Each sunrise was a new promise, and each sunset reminded them of how much they had endured to reach this place. Without the constraints of society or the weight of their past, they were finally free to embrace the love that had long existed only in silence and longing. The years of pain and separation now felt distant, like shadows left far behind. In the quiet of their new life, Richard and Georgiana found what they had always sought, a love that was free, serene, and finally able to blossom without fear of being torn apart by the cruel hands of fate. And so, this love, which once seemed impossible, survived everything: power, intrigue, pride, and even time itself. Who could have imagined that an heir and a maid, separated by so many barriers, would manage to build a life together? It's the kind of story that warms the heart and reminds us that true love can overcome any obstacle. But what about you? How far do you think someone should go to protect the love of their life? Leave the phrase, "True love always wins," in the comments if you enjoyed this video. I created the channel Romances that touch the heart because I'm tired of heavy and sad themes forcing us to see life's darker side. Here, you'll only find stories that make your heart smile and brighten your day. So, if you love happy endings and unforgettable romances, subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell, and leave a like so you don't miss any of these heartwarming stories. And if you loved this story, I think you'll adore the video, "Rich Lord Pretends to be Poor to Find True Love." This time, the protagonist takes surprising risks to discover who truly loves him, even if it means giving up all his wealth. Will he find true love?